serger can stitch, trim, and overcast a seam all in one step at about twice the speed of a conventional machine. We've now seen a serger in action, so let's take a closer look at how a stitch is actually formed. Here we have a lower looper and upper looper interacting with the needle to form the stitch. I'm going to turn the flywheel by hand to very slowly show you exactly how this is done. See the lower looper moving to the right, picking up the needle thread. Now the upper looper is picking up the navy lower looper thread. The needle is catching the pink upper looper thread, going down below the throat plate. Now the lower looper is going to come to the right again and pick up the loop of the white needle thread. It goes over, and there goes the upper looper catching the lower looper thread again, bringing the upper looper thread over to the needle. The needle catches a loop, goes down. The lower looper thread again picks up the white loop of the needle thread, while the upper looper is picking up the navy loop of the lower looper. The needle again catches the upper looper, and we have formed our stitch. Now, of course, we are going quite slowly. If you were to go a little bit faster, as you would do when you normally serge, it would start looking like this. And we can go a little bit faster. And remember, a serger will go up to 1,700 stitches per minute, and that certainly does speed up our sewing.
Today, when you're buying a serger, you really need to be aware of what it can do for you. And there are many different stitch types available. You need to be aware of how you're going to use those stitches and what you need on your machine. On this corduroy dress, just to finish the seam allowances, I used the simplest of the stitches, the 2-thread over edge. This is a 2-thread over edge stitch. The 2-thread over edge is formed by the looper thread, shown in pink, and the needle thread, shown in yellow, looping together to over edge. Because there's not a third thread to form a lock stitch, we don't have a seam. We simply have an over edge. If this were sewn as a seam, it would pull open and you'd have stitches showing. Always test your tension. Always test with a long piece of fabric. That allows you lots of space to check your threads. Sew enough so that you can look at the fabric as it's been seamed. Notice that I have a little navy blue thread coming over to the top side. So when tension is wrong, the first thing you always do is check the machine. Don't turn any dials until you've checked the threading. Remember when we changed our thread and we tied knots and we pulled the knots through? We took the thread out of the clip and we loosened the lower tension. We need to put the thread back in the clip, and we need to tighten the lower tension to a normal tension setting. Then we test again. And now we have a much better looking stitch. A balanced stitch has the upper and lower looper meeting along the cut edge of the fabric, but so that you can actually see air through the two stitches. The needle thread runs in a straight line along the seam line. You shouldn't see a lot of needle thread on the wrong side of the fabric, but just enough that it's holding the lower looper in place. Stitch length is the distance between the stitches. It can be very close, like a satin stitch, a little bit longer, where you can actually see the loops of the thread, or even longer. This is the very longest stitch length on this particular machine, where you see lots of spaces in between the threads. These seams are sewn with the same stitch length. All I've changed is the width. You should be aware of how to change the stitch width on your particular machine, and that again is in your manual. Of course, there are going to be times we're going to sew two layers together as a seam, and you might want to pin. With a serger, you can't pin perpendicular to the seam like you do for normal sewing, because the knife will cut the pins, and that will kill the knife, and then you'll have to spend about $20 on a new knife, and we don't want to do that. So try pinning with the pins parallel to the stitching line, but well away from the knife. It's the same thing, holds it in place and pins. To do a 5/8 inch seam, you want to be aware of where your needle is in relationship to the edge of the fabric. On this particular machine, the 5/8 is marked from the left needle. If I were to sew with the right needle, I would need to change the width that I'm cutting. I'm going to just line the cut edge of the fabric up to my 5/8 inch mark and stitch my seam.